IP's objection number 4, Genesis 1, verse 4, as well as verse 14. Starting with verse 4, it says, "And God saw the light, that it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness." Then verse 14, it says, "And God said, Let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years." End quote. The claim here is the existence of day and night before the existence of the sun, moon, and stars makes no sense. And obviously, as we can see here, verse 4 says we have the creation of light and dividing of light from the darkness, and the existence of day and night doesn't happen until 10 verses later. So the claim is the existence of day and night before the sun, moon, and stars makes no sense. And I'm out of tea. Lame. I'll get some more later. So, my objections. I will freely concede to IP that the scientific answer for how this might have happened may not exist at this time. So, golf claps. We conceded something. We've actually conceded quite a bit during this video, but nevertheless, at the time that I was making this, I guess I was getting particularly sarcastic. At any rate, with that said, it is not as if something like this has not happened before. For example, the scientific answer for why you should wash yourself with water, which we've seen an example of in Leviticus 17:15, when any person eats an animal, quote, "When any person eats an animal which dies or is torn by beasts, whether he is a native or an alien, he shall wash his clothes and bathe in water and remain unclean until even. Then he will become clean." The scientific reason for why you should do that didn't exist until the advent of germ theory, which was developed between the 17th and 19th centuries AD, which was, check notes, a really long time after Leviticus. Depending on when you believe Leviticus was written, if you're the atheist, would say sometime between the 300s and 600s BC. Obviously, we who take a early date of Exodus and believe Moses wrote the Torah, or at least the majority of it, would say as far back as 1400 BC. Even somebody like IP, who would say that the Exodus happened around the Ramesside period, would still say 12th, 13th century BC is when this is written, right? So regardless of which theory we're taking, we're talking about a minimum of 2,100 years into the future and a maximum of 3,000 years into the future. In other words, checks notes, oh yeah, a really long time. So that, of course, did not mean you shouldn't wash yourself with water. And somebody might say, well, yeah, but this is probably more about ritual and cleanness, and that's probably even true. I will grant that. But we did nevertheless discover that, scientifically speaking, it's pretty wise to cleanse yourself after you've touched a carcass, right? Or really just that you should wash yourself, period. And the scientific reason for why that might be a good idea did not exist until after the advent of germ theory, which developed between the 17th and 19th centuries, like I said. In fact, go check out an extra credits video if you're interested. It's about the guy who popularized germ theory in England, named John Snow. And I think it's an excellent video. Of course, it's a YouTube video, but this is a YouTube video, so I digress. Excellent video. You should definitely check it out. So the fact that we may not have the scientific explanation doesn't mean that it's not true. It just means we don't have the scientific explanation for it. I actually recently gave an example of this in one of my open rooms. You know, there's an old saying about how scientists don't know how a bumblebee flies. I've heard from some people that that's actually not true, and I don't actually believe it is true. But let's just assume for a second that it was true, right? Well, scientists may not know why a bumblebee flies, but it does, right? So they would want to figure out how, but none of them would be getting around trying to debunk the idea that bumblebees do in fact fly, because you can walk outside and look at bumblebees and they do in fact fly, right? So whether or not we have the answer for how that happens is actually completely irrelevant to whether or not it does actually happen, right? Besides that, though, it must be noted that while stars are a source of light, we do happen to know for a fact that they are not the source of light. In other words, the only scientific source of light. There's obviously the idea that Jesus Christ himself is the source of light, but even speaking from a strictly scientific perspective, other known sources of light in the year 2024 of our Lord include black holes and quasars, meaning it is at least theoretically possible to have a night and day or light and darkness without having sun, moon, and stars. And another thing I'd like to point out, which I did not think of by the time I had written this whole PowerPoint here, but which I've recently seen from Eric Hovind on Standing for Truth's channel. If you guys have not checked out that interview, excellent interview, consider checking it out. But he pointed out that the existence of a day is actually relative to the existence of Earth, not to the existence of the sun. Now, obviously, that doesn't solve the light problem, but as we said, there's plenty of potential ideas one could come up with to solve the light problem, whether that be Jesus Christ himself or God himself, right, or the Spirit, or something along those lines, or something more scientific like black holes or quasars or something like that. But just the existence of the day on its own, it actually doesn't rely on the existence of the sun. That's something we often hear in these debates, but it's just simply not true. A revolution around the sun is what a year is, but a revolution around the sun is not what a day is, unless it's going to be another 365 days. I guess we're on the 31st day now, so and it's a leap year, so 335 days until nighttime. Unless that's the case, that's just simply not how days work. Now, a day is a rotation of the Earth on its axis, right? So you don't actually need a sun for the Earth to rotate on its axis, right? In fact, there are some planets, I believe Venus is one of them, where a day is actually longer than a year because it takes longer for it to rotate on its axis than it does for it to have a full revolution around the sun, right? So the sun is not actually a requirement to have a day, even scientifically speaking, and that's besides the light point, which, as we just demonstrated, there are theological answers to that question: how could there be light without a sun? As well as potential scientific ones. We know that there are other sources of light like black holes and quasars. Now, I don't have a personal theory for pre-astral light. I'm not a scientist, nor do I pretend to be one on TV. But I can list and have listed for you guys a couple different YEC theories of pre-astral light. So here we go. Theory number one. Some have suggested that pre-astral light is a physical manifestation of the glory of Christ, who is called the true light in John 1. By the way, some of the sources we're about to reference debunk another idea. Many people have suggested that young earth creationism is somehow new, right? Some will very erroneously claim that it wasn't until the 1920s with guys like Henry Morris and the Seventh-day Adventist fellow whose name I can't remember, that people started to actually think in terms of young earth creationism, right? Others who are slightly more careful with their nonsense will at least push it all the way back to Usher, which you literally have to, because he starts a calendar that literally begins in the year 4004 BC. I mean, it's like, anyways, some people just baffle me with the claims they make. All right, like Usher somehow isn't a young earth creationist, but he says that the world began in 4004 BC. Okay, whatever. But nevertheless, even those guys are wrong, because there are plenty of church fathers and also early rabbis who did argue for what we would today call young earth creationism. It's anachronistic to call it young earth creationism, of course, because of the developments that have happened since then. But it would be the equivalent of young earth creationism for the time period. Anyways, I digress. Back to the theory. Some have suggested that the pre-astral light is a physical manifestation of the glory of Christ, who is called the true light in John 1. So this is from Tertullian's work against modalism titled Against Praxeus, chapter 12. It was written in the 3rd century AD, that is the 200s, who are not, for those who are not very good with chronology. Quote, but in respect of the previous works of the world, what says the scripture? Its first statement indeed is made when the sun has not yet appeared, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. Immediately there appears the word, that true light, which lights man on his coming into the world. See John 1 and 9. 1 and verse 9, I mean. And through him also came light upon the world. From that moment God willed, from that moment God willed creation to be affected in the word, Christ being present and ministering unto him, and so God created, end quote. So that's one YEC theory of pre-astral light, is that the sun, the glory of the sun in particular, is that pre-astral light. Here's another. Theory 2. Some have suggested that the pre-astral light was a pillar of fire or bright mist-like body similar to a nebula, which is very interesting because they didn't know what nebula were back then. I'm not saying that necessarily means it's correct, but it intrigues me nevertheless. So this is from Ephraim the Syrian's commentary on Genesis. It's the 4th century, that is the 300s AD. Quote, the light then was like a bright mist over the face of the earth. Whether it was like the dawn or like the pillar that gave light in the wilderness to the people, it is obvious that it was unable to chase away the darkness that was spread over the face of everything, unless it had spread out completely over everything, either by its substance or by its appearance. Okay. Third idea we have for pre-astral light. Some have suggested that the pre-astral light was a kind of essence of the sun without its material substance. This comes from Basil of Caesarea, sorry. This is from his 9 homilies on the Hexameron, homily 4. And this is from the 4th century, again, the 300s. Quote, a lamp is not fire. Fire has the property of illuminating, and we have invented the lamp to light us in the darkness. In this same way, the luminous bodies have been fashioned as a vehicle for that pure, clear, and immaterial light, end quote. Which that's a very interesting idea. I don't know if I agree with it necessarily, but you can definitely see where he's coming from, right? Like a light bulb. I got right up there, right? It's not light itself. I guess you wouldn't say it contains light in the same way a lamp does, because you literally put a fire in a lamp, right? But it is a source of this thing. It's not really a substance, but you know what I mean, that we call light. So you can kind of see where his idea is coming from. And of course, Basil has no idea about any of the modern physics that we have come up with. And for the record, neither do I. So, more credit to Basil. I am not a scientist and I don't play one on TV, right? But continuing forward, theory number 4, some have suggested that the pre-astral light was the luminosity of the angels. Quote, it's from Augustine of Hippo's on the literal interpretation of Genesis, which is called On the Literal Interpretation of Genesis. So those of you who are saying that the literal interpretation of Genesis is a modern invention, stop it. You're just factually wrong. Okay? Quote, but since we may also understand here an incorporeal light, if we say that the book describes not only visible creation, but all of creation, what need is there to delay in this dispute? And since men ask when the angels were made, they are perhaps signified by this light, very briefly, but still most suitably and appropriately, end quote. And again, that's Augustine of Hippo on the literal interpretation of Genesis. Guys, stop, please. Don't do it anymore. It's dumb. Don't. I'm trying to be nice, okay? But it does not behoove you to say things like the literal interpretation of Genesis is something that existed in the 1920s when there was a book from the 4th century literally called on the literal interpretation of Genesis. Stop it, okay? Please. Moving forward. Theory number 5. Some have suggested that the pre-astral light is the Shekinah glory. Quote, the text teaches that the Holy One of Blessing enveloped himself in it, as one does with a cloak, and made the splendor of his glory shine from one end of the world to the other. He told him this, Agadah, in a whisper. He said to him, there is even a full verse about it. He wears light as a cloak, end quote. And this comes from the Midrash Bereshith Rabbah. Bereshith, by the way, is the Hebrew name for Genesis. It means in the beginning. It's actually that very first sentence in the beginning. That's actually how, fun fact, that's how all Hebrew names of the various books of the Old Testament, or as they call it, the Tanakh, are named. You just take that first word there. So Bereshith is what they call Genesis. Anyways, the actual writer here is Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachman, and he's writing around the years 300 to 500 AD. We don't really know, exactly when, but it is the, again, Midrash Bereshith Rabbah and chapter 3. Theory number 6, some have suggested that the pre-astral light is a mobile cloud of fire or a fire-like substance. This is from Matthew Poole. Matthew Poole's commentary on Genesis from the 17th century AD. You can find this commentary on Bible Hub, by the way. Quote, there was light, which was some bright and lucid body, peradventure like the fiery cloud in the wilderness, giving a small and imperfect light, successively moving over the several parts of the earth, and afterwards condensed, increased, perfected, and gathered together in the sun, end quote. Then we have our most recent of the 7 theories I'm giving from Dr. John Whitcomb, who wrote the book The Early Earth. This is from that, published in 1986. He says that the pre-astral light may have been a kind of proto-sun, right? So I don't know if this analogy would necessarily work, but you could say maybe like an acorn to an oak tree. He might take issue with that particular analogy, but just to give you an idea of what he even means by a proto-sun. Quote, God created a fixed and localized light source in the heaven in reference to which the rotating earth passed through the same kind of day and night cycle as it has since the creation of the sun, end quote. And this is probably not an exhaustive list of the theories. I'm sure guys like Dr. Jason Lisle and others have come up with different theories about whether, about how pre-astral light could exist, or even just specifically pre-solar light. But nevertheless, there are plenty of theories. You can take whichever ones you like. I don't think it necessarily matters because, drum roll please, IP broke his own rules. Assume for a moment that all of these theories and any potential other theories are incorrect, okay? Assume that IP's objection is just flatly correct. How is this a biblical problem for young earth creationism? What I mean is, how is this an example of the Holy Bible teaching something other than young earth creationism? If anything, this is a scientific objection to the young earth creation model, not one that derives from the text in so much as that it derives from what the text teaches, right? So let me be clear on what I'm saying there. Obviously, he quoted the text to make this argument, but he's claiming that this text taken literally doesn't make scientific sense. He is not saying the text is telling you that that pre-astral light doesn't exist, right? So this is something that you would see in like a scientific objection, or does the Bible contradict itself conversations or stuff like that, right? But the text clearly does not teach that the light pre-exists, or excuse me, clearly does teach that the light pre-exists sun and stars. And IP is not even actually disputing that claim. He's not rejecting our model on the basis of the text. He's rejecting the model on the basis of his understanding of science. And I think you could go as far as to say, in this particular objection, he's actually denying the scripture on top of the fact that he's breaking his own rules. This is supposed to be 10 biblical objections to young earth creationism. This isn't a biblical objection to young earth creationism, unless you want to count potential contradictions as a biblical objection. But really, at its core, this is a scientific objection to young earth creationism, right? And so it really doesn't have any place on this list, in my opinion. And like I said, I think there are people who are much smarter than I in these particular fields who have done a fairly decent job at trying to solve the problem of pre-astral light in the scriptures. But I digress.